Okay, guys, we're back with another video. This time we're talking about one of my absolute favorite things. It's one of the things that made me want to be a scientist. It's called scientific method. In a nutshell, scientific method is just an organized way for you to solve problems. What we did for convenience sake here is we kind of put the steps of the scientific method in a set order. It's important for you to realize there is no set order for scientific method. These are just suggestions, and when you go to solve a problem, you may not even use all of the steps. You may not use them in the same order. Once we look at these steps, I think you're going to realize that this is stuff that you guys do all the time, whether you're making a glass of chocolate milk, beating a level on the Xbox, or trying to find a faster way to get to class. Let's take a look at the first slides.
So traditionally, the first part of the scientific method is simply stating the problem, recognizing that there is a problem. The whole goal behind this is that you want to identify it so you know what you're going to investigate, and then eventually the purpose is to get the answers. So when you do a lab and we say you have a purpose, the purpose is just simply getting answers to whatever it might be. This could be like maybe, for example, you're trying to get that camper during Call of Duty, the guy who's sitting there the whole time and you get fragged by him all the time. Like, you know what? Start testing it out. That's your problem.
All right, so the next step to the scientific method is to gather information. Now, this is before you get a really formalized experiment going. So there are different sources you could use for finding information, whether it be the internet, but I will say with the internet, make sure you are careful about your sources.
Be skeptical.
Yes, be skeptical of your sources. Oop, I didn't mean to flip forward there. But as well as, if you know any experts in a field, to ask them. I had a problem with insects in my house one time, and I happen to know a few insect experts. Don't ask how, but I do. But I went to them for information. It was a good first source. So make sure you use good sources, and it's always good to have a good background information before you actually get going into an experiment.
I'll take this one.
All right.
One of the biggest parts, I think you guys already know, you've heard this term before, and everybody has this idea floating around in their head that a hypothesis is an educated guess. That's a little soft for us here. Actually, what a hypothesis is, it's a prediction that's testable. You've got to be able to test it. You can't say it's magic. You can't just say it came like out of nowhere or it like came from a spaceship or something. And it's got to be hopefully a proposed solution to your problem. So you come up with a problem, you think, I think it's this, I can test it like this. It has to have a measurable outcome. Something that you can get and measure it, quantify it. It can't be a guess or an opinion. You've got to have some data that'll come from that. We'll talk about that in a little bit. In this example, we're going to talk about this in a little bit. Let's say that I use Scott's fertilizer. And if I use Scott's fertilizer, my sunflowers are going to grow very tall. So that's my hypothesis. I'm going to try to grow up some sunflowers using Scott's fertilizer, and I think that's going to be best. We'll kind of walk through the next parts of the scientific method using this kind of idea.
Another thing to remember about hypothesis is you should create your hypothesis based on the data that you've collected and the research you've done.
Yeah, step 2 sort of adds into step 3, and to kind of add on to Mr. Harkin's example too, notice he said taller, not necessarily better. That's
Yes.
something you can measure, is taller. You've set forward how you're actually going to test that. Or
And
how
now
you're
here's a
gonna
question for you
evaluate.
guys. I'm always curious on this. Does a hypothesis, for a good hypothesis, does it have to be right? Does it have to come up to be correct in the end?
No?
No, I'd actually argue that some of the best ones are the ones that come out wrong, because then it gives you more information and tells you that you need to do more research. And look
So a
into
good
it.
hypothesis could be wrong. It just has to be measurable,
Mhm.
and it has to be based off of what your observations are.
Definitely. And test.
Very good.
Very good. Yeah. Testable is the most important part,
Yes,
really, not
because
whether
all
it's
other parts
correct.
come with that, don't they?
Yep. So the next piece is setting up your experiment. The experiment is traditionally like the lab that you might do, for example, in our class. Now, one of the key parts to an experiment, there's a lot of parts to it. One of the key parts is this thing called a variable, and that's the conditioner factor that you're going to test in the experiment. Now, there's usually 2 main types of variables. You have an independent variable and you have a dependent variable. The independent one is the one that I would change if I was going to do the experiment. So in the case of the fertilizer one, I might have some flowers planted with Scott fertilizer and the other one with like dirt, just plain old dirt. Like my variable there is the fertilizer going to make a difference? Okay, the thing is I'm controlling which one gets that fertilizer. The dependent variable is the one that we're then looking at trying to see what is the effect. In this case, did the plants grow taller? Because it depends on the fertilizer, hopefully, in that case. What we end up with then is something called a controlled experiment, which Mr. Carnson will explain.
Yeah, so a controlled experiment, it's, whenever you do any sort of experiment where you're trying to figure out, like, is one thing better than the other, it's important that that is the only thing that you're testing.
Yes.
So if I was going to try this sunflower experiment, I would make sure that everything else I do in that experiment, say I have like 3 pots and I'm going to have dirt in one pot, Miracle-Gro in another, and what was it, Scott's fertilizer in the other. I'm not going to change any other thing. I'm going to grow the same exact types of sunflowers, use the same exact type of dirt besides just changing the fertilizer. I'm not going to use different pots, expose them to different amounts of sunlight, because if I do that, I've made my experiment invalid. So the way to set this up is you have what's called a control group and you have an experimental group. You could have more than one experimental group. There usually is. But this is the minimum. You need 2 groups. The control group is that group that you do not change anything at all. And the reason is because let's say my sunflowers that just have dirt grow just the same as that Miracle-Gro. It turns out, hey, Miracle-Gro didn't do anything because I have that comparison. If I hadn't done that, I have no idea whether Miracle-Gro was more effective or not. And experimental groups are just whichever things you actually change, whatever you've done with the independent variable, things that you change, that is the experimental group.
Okay, let me stop you guys here because we got a lot of terms. Could you go back one slide on here? I have a question.
I can.
So, if I got this right, what you're saying is the independent variable is a variable that we can change. It's independent. It changes on its own. It does its own thing. And the dependent variable depends on the independent variable.
Yep.
So if you change the dependent variable is going to change in some different way with it.
Hopefully.
Hopefully.
And if it doesn't change, then that tells you something also. It tells you that it has no effect on it.
Okay. How many things am I supposed to change in a good experiment?
Just one.
Only one.
Just one? I can't change like the dirt and the fertilizer and the sunlight on it and just mix it all up and see what happens?
Nope, because then you won't know what caused the effect.
Oh, because if one grows taller than the other one and I change 2 or 3 things, I don't know was it the sunlight or the dirt or the water or the fertilizer that made it grow taller.
Exactly.
That's why you only want to change one
so
thing.
change one thing, and the one thing we change is that independent variable.
Yep.
That's not too bad. Okay, I'm good.
All right, so really quickly, and I did sort of say this already, but just to see it in words, an example of this control experiment would be you'd have all these experimental groups, which is using the different fertilizers, and then the control group would be using no fertilizer at all.
And just like we just mentioned a second ago when Mr. Harkins asked us, like it says at the bottom, everything else is exactly the same. You don't change anything else.
That makes sense.
So once you have your experiment set up, the next thing you're going to do is run the experiment. And while you're running the experiment, you need to actually collect some information. And that's what the data is. Data is the information that you gather from an experiment, whether it be the height of the plant, you're measuring it, whether it's visual, maybe you took a picture of it, maybe you drew a table, maybe you have graphs. All that stuff is just data that you're going to then compile or put together, getting all the little bits and pieces of information that you possibly can from the experiment so that you can then use that later to actually come up with a conclusion.
Mr. Black, a quick question. Where do you put the data at? I've got a bunch of numbers all
there's
over.
a whole-
Do I just dump it, or is there something that I put it, like, where do I put
There's
that
a couple different ways you can do that. One of the easiest ways of recording data is a data table, like we have down here at the bottom here.
Oh, okay.
A data table works nice because it's nice, it's neat, it's organized, it's easy to read, there's no confusion, you know what number goes with what, and you can see exactly what's there. And then you can actually take that and put it into a graph to make it even easier to see what the data is telling you. So the data table organizes the data. The graph is a nice way of giving you an easy way, visual way of seeing what the data is actually doing.
So I should probably make my data table an empty data table, write it out, maybe scribble it out on the back of my lab sheet or something, as I collect my data, or maybe a little bit before, and then I can make my graph based on the information I put into that data table?
Definitely, definitely.
And we will be practicing
That
that,
makes
in
sense.
class quite a bit in the
Yep.
next few days.
I'll make sure I show up.
And I'll also mention too that I have actually seen really high-level scientific papers where they just use pictures in it, because as the old cliche says, a picture is worth 1,000 words.
It's
So
still
you can-
data.
Yeah,
Yep.
it is data. And then finally, that data allows us to make what we call a conclusion. So your conclusion is the final statement, and that analyzes what you have learned in an experiment. As I just said, conclusions are always based on the data that you get, and really all the conclusion is a statement in which you say what you found out and what you actually learned from the experiment you just did.
The key thing with the conclusion, though, is that you let your data help you create your conclusion. So whenever you're going to make a statement about what you learned, you better have the information or the facts, in this case your data, to back up what you're saying.
If
You don't want to just make up something random, say like, our flowers grew large because it's Sunday, or something weird like that, because that makes no sense.
Yes, the conclusion, if you do this whole scientific method and then don't use your data to make the conclusion, you have pretty much just wasted your entire time.
Yep.
You've undid all the work you just did. So the conclusion, it is very important, and we're going to talk in class how to make a good conclusion. It's not really on this slide, but you have to make a good conclusion or else you've almost undone all the work that you just did.
So what you're saying
pressure.
then is anything that I write in my conclusion has to be supported by the data that I collected.
Exactly.
So I can't say that Scott's made my plants grow tallest when maybe my plants only grew 20 centimeters with Scott's and they grew 150 centimeters with Miracle-Gro. I can't say
Exactly.
Scott's grew
Nope.
taller just because I thought it would.
Exactly.
I have to follow the data for my conclusion.
You have to be willing to accept that you might be wrong.
Mm-hmm.
It's okay because if you did good science,
Then you're right.
good.
Now, what we're going to move on to next, this is what happens when you have lots and lots of experiments and lots of data. You can end up with two different things. One called a theory and one called a law. I'm going to let Mr. Black explain this because I think he does a very good job.
So the easiest way to explain this is to look at law first. A law is just simply an observation of some naturally occurring event that you see happening. You don't do any editorializing. In other words, you don't try to explain it. You just simply say, hey, this ball went up in the air and then it fell. That's all you say. Okay? The theory is what you then use to try to explain why the ball is falling after you've thrown it in the air. And the key thing with the theory is that it's something that's been supported over and over and over again with lots and lots and lots of good research and lots of good testing and experimentation. And the end result is that you come up with something that you think might be the best explanation. One thing to remember also is that laws, they pretty much stay the same. They don't really change because it's just
Okay.
an observation that you make. A theory can get changed, modified, can be thrown out completely. We can create a whole new one as we gain more and more evidence as we move through things.
Okay, I've got a question. I've seen people on TV before say, I've got a theory on this, or I have a theory on that. Is that the same as an idea? Like I have an idea, can I just say I have a theory and it's this kind of theory, or?
I would actually argue that a lot of times when people are saying that, what they're really meaning to say is that they have an inference about something. Because they're just simply saying, like, this is kind of what I think is happening, even though I haven't had a chance to really do any testing.
Oh, so inference, as we talked about in an earlier video, we're talking about that's kind of an opinion or an idea based on something you see, but it's not based on actual data.
Exactly.
Right.
It's kind of our opinion of something, our idea behind it. So it's really not a theory you would have then. A
Exactly.
theory is very specific.
And very
Right.
tested. You could kind of look at that like anytime you do an observation of something, you first kind of initially create an inference. You do a little bit of research. You're making a hypothesis. You test that hypothesis. You adjust it. You retest it. You retest it. You retest it.
Okay.
You retest it. And eventually, over time, that can become a theory. And I kind of look at it as the most likely explanation with the current information that we have.
Mm-hmm.
So it works the same all the time. It matches all of our current knowledge. It's always giving us the same results on there, even if we don't have every piece of the puzzle.
Right.
Interesting.
All right. Well, that was kind of a long video.
Yeah, it was. Sorry.
Hopefully you caught all the information. This might be your longest video of the year. We actually discussed that while we were starting to make it.
And now we're making it longer.
Yes,
So I
we
think
are.
we're going to end right there.
All right. Have a good day.
Later.